Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Early on in his work, The Poetics, Aristotle will provide us with an overview of the development of different genres, different types of mimetic poesis, that is, poetry, that's how we typically translate it, that is imitative, and tragedy, which he seems to consider to be one of the most highly developed sorts. In some respects, it's even better than epic, right? As we're going to see towards the end of the work, is going to be a relative latecomer, and it is emerging out of other types of poetry, which is something quite important. And Aristotle thinks that it actually does have a sort of teleologically driven process of development. Not that there's, some god above who's like, poetry, let's develop it. Or people saying, all right, what do we actually need to do? Let's do some backwards design or anything along those lines. But rather that over time, as a, let's say, outpouring or function of human nature, these dramatic forms, these ways of engaging in mimesis, they get more and more complex, and other parts get shaved away, and they attain some sort of stable, position, state that would be what it is that they are going to be, their nature, their physis, as he's going to call it. And he begins the section where he's talking about the development by saying, to consider whether or not tragedy is, even now at this point, a day, sufficiently developed in its types, or whether it has its types, tois edesin, hikanos whether or not it has this, well, that's going to be a separate matter. And he talks about judging it in relation to itself and in relation to the spectator, judging krinesai, establishing a judgment. Interesting in part because the audience are sometimes also looked at as the judges, right? So he's not going to worry too much about that, and instead he's going to provide us with a bit of a historical narrative. He tells us that tragedy is going to develop out of dithyram. So what is dithyram? It is a kind of choral performance devoted to Dionysos. It's kind of bawdy, kind of goofy. I mean, Dionysos is not just the god of wine, but what happens to you when you drink wine. But it's not quite as bad in that respect as what comedy develops out, right? Phallic songs, right? So where they'd carry a big phallus around and sing some songs. Comedy is, according to Aristotle, coming out of that. And he says that it develops out of dithyram in an improvisational way. And we've got this long term there, autoschediastikes, right? So in a way that is, you might say driven by its own developments. And he talks about the leaders, things coming from the leaders, apoton ex archonton. So the leaders of the chorus start doing something new. Now, who are these leaders of the chorus? Are you thinking just like the person who's involved in the chorus and is one of the singers, one of the reciters, also dancers, and like the most important one, it could be that. Or it could also be the person who is writing the stuff for them and, leading them in the sense of directing them. We don't actually know. But somebody is coming along and saying, let's do something different. Let's do something more. And he says that it was gradually enhanced, kate mikron euxesthe, right? So this is coming from auxein, to grow, right? Auxesis is the process of growth. And by the way, that's also used in linguistic terms as a sort of device of rhetoric in Aristotle's rhetoric. Auxesis is when you have like a certain amount of stuff to say about something and you amplify it. You make it bigger, not just in terms of longer, but elevating it as well. So it's gradually being enhanced. Why? Because the people who are driving it, pro agonton, right, the poets it's translated here, and that's perfectly reasonable, are seeing something that can be developed in it. Now, the translation here, the potential, doesn't actually say potential as such, but you could certainly read that in. And so then tragedy goes through many changes, polas, metabolas, right? Many changes, even revolutions, is a very strong translation of that term. And then it stops. Epausato. It stopped back in the past, according to Aristotle, to change any further, right? It stops changing. Why does it do that? Well, Aristotle says that it had achieved its own nature, or more literally, it had epe esche ten autes fusin. So fusin is the nature of something. So you've got a nature of a human being, rational animal, the principles by which we come to be. Aristotle says that a horse has a phusis, a house has a phusis. Poetry, types of poetry can have their own phusis as well, which is coming out of human nature engaging with other humans and the world, and engaging in mimesis. So this type of mimesis attains the fullness of its nature according to Aristotle, a fullness that it didn't have before and didn't have completely along the way. He talks about two poets in particular, who, if you know about Greek tragedy, you know these two guys. He says Aeschylus innovated, right? Literally, egage, he drove something. How did he do that? By raising the number of actors from 1 to 2. Now that's a very interesting observation, isn't it? So before Aeschylus, what do you have? You have the chorus, who's doing a lot of the talking. You have one person who stands out as an actor, probably wearing a mask, perhaps in a different costume, and telling the story, saying certain things. Now, when you have two, you have the possibility not just of talking with the chorus, but of dialogue between two characters. So in Aeschylus, we have two characters on the stage, as well as the chorus. He reduced the choral component, meaning that he's giving the chorus less line, less importance. Literally, he lessens the chorus, right? Ta tu choru e lachose, right? And he also gives a priority to something else. He makes speech, or logos, which could also translate as reasoning, right, more central to what's going on. And this is how we get to something that looks like what we're used to as plays. Sophocles, next really important Greek tragedian in Athens, comes along and he raises the number of actors on stage from 2 to 3, and also gets involved with scene painting, scenographian, so literally writing or drawing on the scene, right? The scenery, we could say. And then Aristotle's going to talk about some further developments, and I think we have to read these back into Aeschylus and Sophocles, because it doesn't make any sense if we're saying, well, first Aeschylus did this, and then Sophocles did this, and then afterwards people did this. This dimension of grandeur, greatness, in Greek megathos, is there in Aeschylus, is there in Sophocles, isn't it? You know, it's very important people. Think about Aeschylus with the Oresteia, right? It's Agamemnon who's coming home, Clytemnestra who kills him, and then we have the story of what's going to happen with Electra and Orestes, right? And we have gods coming in. So that's grandeur, right? That's pretty important. So we have a change in grandeur. Why? Because originally these are satiric plays, right? And satiric plays are, don't necessarily think of satire. Think of like screwing around, crazy stuff, wild stuff. So in the process, it moves from being this kind of commonplace, but also joking, to developing dignity. Ap semnesthe, right? What does that mean? It develops semnos, dignity, piety in a certain way, right? It develops a seriousness to it that we do see in Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides. Aristotle's also going to say that we see a development in terms of plot and in terms of diction, going from slight plots or little plots, mikron, muthon, right? Plots that aren't really very important at all. The chorus is doing all the work, and there's a plot or a story that's being brought up to the story is dominating. By the time that we get to Aristotle, muthos, plot, is the most important element of tragedy, according to him, right? Laughable diction, lexeos, geloias. So geloia means something that we would actually laugh at, something that we would find funny. So it's not funny because the person intended it to be funny. It's not comedy. It's just they weren't very good at the very beginning of this in writing good dialogue, good language for the characters. And we also see a difference in meter coming up. Why? Well, this is very interesting. So originally, Aristotle says there's a big emphasis on dancing, which is part of this Dionysic, ritual that's being carried out. So dancing and tetrameter works good for that. So you speak in a way that fits the dance moves, you could say, right? Probably music going on at the same time. And it shifts to spoken dialogue, which means it shifts to iambic trimeter. Why? So the dialogue, the lexeos, notice it's the same term, diction and dialogue. The way in which people talk is being imitated here in a better form. He says, the iambic trimeter, more than any other meter, has the rhythm of speech. An indication of this is that we speak many trimeters in conversation with one another, but hexameters only rarely and when diverging from the colloquial register. Now, how would we put this in terms of our own contemporary English? Well, we would say that Aristotle's talking about going from one way of talking, which fits song lyrics better, to actual ways in which people speak with each other. So, we don't really think of ancient tragedy as being representative of speech, but that is the case. He also talks about changing the number of episodes, right? And so what is this? He calls this the plethe, the extent, the number of the parts of the story. An episode is a portion of the plot, right? You don't want to have too many of these. Aristotle actually later on talks about some plays that have too many episodes in them. So there's sort of a concentration that's going on. The other thing that he talks about that's really quite interesting, thought-provoking, in terms of the development of tragedy is something that happens once tragedy is actually on the scene as a recognizable genre. And I think here we could contrast Aeschylus and Sophocles with later writers like Euripides or, Agathon, who we don't have plays by, but we know about a little bit through Plato and also through things that Aristotle says in the Rhetoric. So plot is the first principle, right? He says, and also we have, other things that are important. Third in importance is thought, dianoia. He says, which is, in formal speeches, in actual talking, is the task of two different disciplines. One is he politike. We translate that as political science, right? Or you could think of it as social science. And then he rhetorike, rhetoric. So these are the disciplines that help us learn how to speak well. Great. Now here's where things have changed. He tells us that earlier poets made people speak politically, right? So like statesmen, as if they were engaged in political matters, right? The Greek word for that just means in the way of political science, politikos, right? And nowadays, they speak rhetorically. So Aristotle is referring to his own time and perhaps close by in time as well. This is a change. They speak now rhetorikos, right? So how exactly should we interpret this? I don't think we should place too much stress on it. Like, they're no longer caring about the common good or anything like that. But there is a significant change in diction, in lexis, and also in dianoia, in the kind of thought that they're expressing, in the way that they argue, the way in which they present things, that Aristotle is noting here. So this is how Aristotle, up to his own time, thinks that tragedy has developed, and according to him, come to its sort of fruition in which we can actually see its full nature, which is what he's going to describe in the rest of the work.